The United States had already seen its share of disasters, from back-to-back hurricanes that devastated Texas, Florida, and the U.S. Virgin Islands to roaring wildfires in the West, then, after battering the rest of the Caribbean. Hurricane Maria left the island of Puerto Rico facing a humanitarian crisis. About a dozen people died in the Sept. 21 storm and the island was plunged into darkness. Now, some 3.4 million Puerto Ricans, which is to say, 3.4 million American citizens, are confronting life without electricity, gas, cellular service, and, in many cases, a home. After a decade of fiscal decline and a May 2017 bankruptcy, Puerto Rico has become exceptionally vulnerable to disasters like Maria. As both a policy analyst and the daughter of Puerto Rican immigrants, I'm concerned about how austerity-related reforms are now threatening the survival of not just my family there but everyone on the island. Though food insecurity, poor healthcare, and resource-starved public transit all predate the hurricane, the result of both damaging U.S. policy and deepening financial crisis, these three problems will dramatically complicate Puerto Rico's recovery. Food insecurity. Because Puerto Rico imports over 85% of its food security on the island has always been fragile. The U.S. territory has been rationing supplies since Hurricane Irma in early September. But according to Puerto Rico's former Secretary of Agriculture, it may have just 1 month's worth of food on hand. Puerto Rico's main port reopened Sept. 23, allowing 11 ships to begin arriving with aid and resources, including clean water and food. Even so, distributing supplies across the 3,515 square mile island will prove difficult on roadways damaged by flooding, debris, and downed power lines. Puerto Rico's food supply is also uncertain given that several islands from which it imports food, including the Dominican Republic, Dominica, and St. Martin, were also hit hard. And if the island goes without power for up to 6 months, the shelf life of the meat, vegetables, fruit, and other staples of the traditionally fresh Puerto Rican diet will be awfully short. This is the U.S. territory's second food shortage in recent years. When a Puerto Rico-bound cargo vessel, El Faro, sank during Hurricane Joaquin in 2015. Residents spent months in strife as the government struggled to develop a plan that ensured everyone had enough to eat. Prior to World War II, Puerto Rico actually had an agricultural economy, producing and exporting sugar cane, tobacco, and citrus fruits. But post-war industrialization and growing stigma around farm work led to a downturn. Today, the island can't feed its populace or compete with developed countries' agribusiness and cheap prices. In response, Puerto Rico has made an effort to grow domestic food production, which has increased 24% in the past 5 years. But Maria's winds and floodwaters demolished these gains in bananas, plantains, coffee, dairy, and corn production. Roughly 80% of Puerto Rico's crop value just vanished overnight, a loss of approximately $780 million. Poor healthcare. Puerto Rico had poor healthcare before Hurricanes Irma and Maria, but the storms will exacerbate this desperate situation, too. Ravaged by austerity, hospitals and other healthcare facilities saw their budgets cut by 15% from 2011 to 2015. Countless public clinics across the island closed during the past year, while 4 hospitals have filed for bankruptcy. The island is also short on healthcare professionals, with 72% of Puerto Rico's 78 municipalities deemed medically underserved. This deficient system will face grave challenges in providing medical care to Puerto Ricans injured during and after the storm. Serious cuts and broken bones are extremely common following hurricanes, as are heat-related and infectious illnesses. Loss of power may also lead to the worsening of illnesses for residents with such chronic conditions as diabetes, heart disease, psychiatric disorders, and HIV, whose medications require refrigeration. My own abuela, grandmother, a diabetic who began having mild cardiac episodes last year, is one Puerto Rican among thousands in this situation. These domestic barriers to medical care are magnified by the ongoing debate around healthcare in the U.S. Even though Puerto Rico residents are more likely to be poor, elderly and diagnosed with a chronic illness than the general population, caps to Medicaid reimbursements have forced several hospitals on the island to cut services, close wings, leave positions unfilled, and reduce employee hours and pay. In the wake of this natural disaster, experts expect Puerto Rico's hospitals to be overburdened, especially in San Juan and other metropolitan areas, where most medical facilities are located. In recent days, Gov. Ricardo Rossello has resorted to retweeting information about which hospitals are open and receiving patients. Transportation shortages. Many Puerto Ricans will not be able to reach help, though. Upwards of 45% of the population lives in poverty, and an estimated 35,000 riders depend daily on public transit to get around. With a limited budget, an aging infrastructure, and too few vehicles to support the island's population, however, the Transit Authority has been struggling to meet needs. The agency underwent austerity-related budget cuts in 2015, operating at a deficit until finally, in May 2017, it filed for bankruptcy. This history has complicated evacuation efforts. Locals were puzzled at the "leave or die" warning sent to Isabela residents on Sept 23 when a large crack in the Guajataca Dam threatened to flood surrounding areas. How exactly were they supposed to leave? And how could they get out on roadways long since rendered impassable? As rescue and recovery efforts continue, transportation shortages have effectively left many residents reachable only by helicopter. People across the island are already suffering the consequences. One family, Iris Gonzalez Colazo, 74, and her two sisters, Carmen, 73, and Sarah, 72, of Utauto municipality, exemplifies the cascading effect of this tragedy. All three women had immobilizing health complications and, unable to evacuate, were killed on Sept 24 when a mudslide buried the home where they rested. An American humanitarian crisis. If the situation in Puerto Rico seems dire, that's because it is. People on the island will face seemingly insurmountable problems in nearly every aspect of their lives for months to come. The Trump administration, which has thus far demonstrated a notable lack of concern for the island, could provide some urgent disaster relief by responding Gov. Rossello's request for increased aid for law enforcement and transportation, among other basic needs. The U.S. Congress could also play a role in the territory's longer-term recovery. Increasing the island's Medicaid funding, for example, would save lives in this critical time and free up some of the territory's scarce funds for other purposes. While FEMA picked up the pace of aid 5 days after the storm, few Puerto Ricans anticipate that they'll see the kind of historic federal disaster relief sent to Texas and Florida after Hurricanes Harvey and Irma. Fortunately, Puerto Rico has a culture of resilience. Since the storm, residents have stepped up to help, feed, and shelter one another. If the U.S. federal government won't save Puerto Rico, we Puerto Ricans will.